Welcome to today's Energy Central webcast entitled ScottMadden's Energy Industry Update, Neither Fish Nor Fowl. A few housekeeping notes we'd like to mention. For best results in viewing this presentation, we recommend using a wired high-speed internet connection, as wireless connections can be unpredictable. If you cannot get adequate sound from your computer speakers, you may dial into the audio portion using the telephone numbers listed in the right-hand panel of your interface under the audio section. Following the presentation, we'll have a brief question and answer period. You may submit your questions at any time using the interface on your screen. And I'm happy to turn the floor over to our moderator, Stuart Pearman, Partner and Energy Practice Leader. Stuart, welcome to the event. You have the floor.
Thank you, BJ, and welcome everyone. There are a lot of you online. We'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. It is an exciting time in our industry, and things seem, well, a little bit unusual to us. In what has been a central station generation industry, distributed resources like solar PV are taking hold. In what has been sort of a utilities-only club, non-traditional players are increasingly part of the mix and show up at the regulatory table. We're transforming the grid, but then cybersecurity becomes a bigger worry. The regulatory rules of the game may be changing, but no one can really tell you how much and in what way. So these contrasts to us seem a little unusual, and that's why we have themed our just-released Scott Madden Energy Industry Update, Neither Fish Nor Fowl. Today's webinar is based on that update and includes 3 of the 15 topics we'll cover in this issue, which we just released yesterday. The Energy Industry Update, if you're not familiar with it, goes out to about 10,000 industry leaders. One CEO told us, "I look forward to it, I read every word." You'll receive a copy as a webinar attendee today. So please let me introduce your presenter so we can get going for you. As PJ mentioned, I'm Stuart Pearman, Partner and Energy Practice Leader. John Peng, Partner, will serve as our first speaker. And John is going to talk about Hawaii. Everyone has talked about Hawaii and postcards from the future, but along with SEPA, Scott Madden led 25 utility executives on a fact-finding mission to Hawaii. So they wrote postcards from the future back to the mainland. John will tell us what they said. Like Hawaii, Texas is another learning laboratory where munis and co-ops provide full retail service in a setting that's largely retail deregulated, and they are innovating. Along with SEPA, we also led a fact-finding trip there, and Mark Miller, Partner and Public Power and Electric Cooperatives Practice Leader, will tell us what they learned. Then John Kerner, Partner and IT Practice Leader, will talk about cybersecurity and IT, information technology, and OT, operational technology convergence. Can cats and dogs really be friends? Helping us out behind the scenes as your questions come in will be Greg Leitra, Partner and Energy, Clean Tech, and Sustainability Research Leader. So with no further ado, let's move with John Peng. John, can you please tell us what's going on in Hawaii?
Great. Thank you, Stuart. Hawaii is known for its great beaches and wonderful hospitality, but that's not the reason that the Smart Electric Power Alliance, or SEPA, and Scott Madden took a group of approximately 25 energy industry executives to Honolulu in the fall of last year. The purpose of this fact-finding mission was to explore the impacts of the high penetration of PV solar in Hawaii, and then transfer the lessons learned to other utilities around the country. Executives on this trip included officials from the utilities, the solar industry, other distributed energy resource companies, and industry organizations. I'm going to give you some background on Hawaii and then jump into the lessons learned that we had regarding the operational and technical issues, customer and stakeholder relations, and then on leadership and managing change. So let me start off with some background on Hawaii. Hawaii is an isolated grid consisting of several island systems. They are unable to leverage neighboring islands or balancing supply or system stability, and there is no interconnection between the islands. And obviously there's no interconnection back to the mainland either. A forced outage at a single plant has a much greater impact on system reliability than it does on the mainland, where there's interconnection with a larger grid. Because of this, Hawaii is not subject to NERC or FERC and are very much standalone systems with inherent microgrid issues. Generation has historically been very dependent on oil, and they have had some of the highest electricity prices in the U.S. The islands are approximately 25 to 30% residential load, and there's very little industrial base, but still a small number of big users in the military and hotels. And there's a fairly good load factor of approximately 70%, partly due to not a lot of air conditioning on the islands. In the past few years, there's been an exponential growth in solar PV systems that has been driven by net metering. This non-utility solar growth has added approximately $2 billion with a B in customer-owned assets to the grid in the past few years. The request volume has been overwhelming to interconnect residential rooftop solar to the distribution system, and there is currently a significant number of circuits on their grid with greater than 100% of minimum load. On the other side, there is relatively little utility scale PV, but a continued push for more as Hawaii drives towards their 100% renewable target. PJ, can we move to the next slide? So the operational and technical issues associated with the power grid in Hawaii have been challenging, but have not broken the system without it crashing down. The electricity grids in Hawaii are being stretched beyond what engineering experts originally thought could be handled. 15% of customers, more than 70,000 roofs in Hawaii, have rooftop solar. 30% of single-family homes in Oahu have rooftop solar, which is 20 times the national average. Reverse power flow is the new normal and is approaching the point where 50% of all circuits backfeed into the substation. Half of the circuits generate more power than they use during the day. At the system level, reliability has decreased with the high penetration of rooftop solar, but the system is still operable. Engineers are working within the constraints to mitigate the changing environment, and distributed generation is becoming much less of a passive resource on the grid through the use of smart inverters, load management, smart grids, and storage. And so engineers recognize that if oversupply from distributed generation outpaces grid modifications, the result will be both decreased load and decreased ancillary services provided from their thermal plants. So really the key lessons learned regarding operational and technical issues on this fact-finding mission were that we need to expect that the grid can take more. And then secondly, the technical issues are challenging, but not impossible to solve with the right economics and regulatory environment. Next slide, PJ. So regarding customers and stakeholder relations, all parties vastly underestimated the rapid growth of rooftop solar that was coming. The declining costs of solar rooftop, coupled with customers' desire to lower their electricity bills, create a market for solar developers. The solar developers went door to door and had front porch conversations, putting themselves between the customer and the utility. Utilities were caught off guard in their existing ways of long-term central generation planning. They were also constrained by the traditional regulatory process. The utilities did not recognize that market drivers were quickly passing them by and creating a demand for change that they had not experienced before. The utilities were put in a very difficult situation dealing with the customers and their regulators. This did not create the necessary alignment and trust between the parties. Lack of effective communication between the utilities and their customers further eroded that level of trust. In addition, the utilities were slow to develop options for their customers, for example, community or utility scale solar programs, and they appeared to be holding up the development of solar by denying residential rooftop interconnections. The utility did not approve the request because they were using a very conservative approach, and they were concerned with the technical issues of interconnections. What appeared to the utilities as a prudent approach to risk may have appeared as a no to their customers. So in retrospect, the utilities may have been better served to quickly approve the interconnections, which they approved all of them, and use a yes and approach to limit or control certain conditions of the interconnections. So the key lessons learned were market drivers can easily outpace the utility regulatory and utility planning cycles. Do not estimate customers' off-grid options, and then establish trust by communicating with stakeholders. And finally, be the enabler of solutions by saying yes and. This approach would allow the utility to clarify customer and regulatory goals and better explain what would be needed to achieve those goals. And in Hawaii, such a strategy would have permitted the growth of distributed solar while ensuring appropriate investments in system integrity. Further, the utility would have been better aligned with customers' desires and better able to test and improve the electric system as needed. Next slide, PJ. So regarding leadership and managing change, what we learned was utility leaders need to develop and drive a clear vision to align the internal organizations and break down silos. Change can be slow. The utility's lack of a clear message and proactive communications allowed solar developers to go door to door with the utility customers. The utilities did very little to control the conversation about PV and utilized a heavy-handed approach to hold up the interconnection queue. The utility was not prepared and was forced to play from behind. It appeared that the utility struggled with the sheer volume of interconnection agreements and the thousands of PV systems on the grid. Once this momentum built, the utilities had problems being able to manage the volume. In this environment, traditional utility planning and regulatory practices did not work. When the outcome is uncertain, the rules have to be flexible, and the utility was not innovative and was reluctant to step outside of its traditional practices. An example of this was early on, HNEI, a research facility, approached the utility with a fast response battery energy storage system, which the utilities were reluctant to support. However, as a small system was tested, the utilities engineers became strong supporters, and so did the utility. And so utility execs need to try these different approaches. Utility execs also need to have internal alignment in order to try different things. And to do this, they must also establish checkpoints and milestones. One of the things we learned was that we don't strive for perfection, but we should really iterate and improve. So our key lessons learned were anticipate change and get ahead of it before it overwhelms you. Ensure the organizations speak with one voice, and then establish checkpoints and milestones, iterate and improve. So similar to storm response, a utility may not know all of the issues, but relies on commitment and ingenuity to actively manage the situation. We feel that this approach will be beneficial to utilities going through changes like the ones faced in Hawaii.
Thank you, John. Mark Miller, please tell us about the great state of Texas. You have the floor.
Thanks, Stuart. As Stuart mentioned, we partnered with the Smart Electric Power Alliance to lead energy industry executives on a fact-finding mission to Texas. The mission to Texas was about exploring a unique market and understanding both the leadership and innovation of the public power and cooperative utilities in solar power generation, and the factors impacting development of solar power in the deregulated market. Next slide, please, PJ. So as we see on the slide in front of us, Texas is two distinct markets. On the one hand, Texas deregulated investor-owned utilities almost 15 years ago unbundling these companies to create competition in both wholesale power generation and retail electric service. Municipal utilities, also known as public power or munis for short, and electric cooperatives were provided with an option to opt in or stay out of the competitive retail market. So all municipal utilities and almost all of the co-ops remain outside the competitive retail market. The Electric Reliability Council of Texas, or ERCOT for short, manages wholesale power scheduling and transmission. So in ERCOT territory, 75% of the load is in the competitive retail market, while 25% is in muni and co-op territory. To understand the Texas market, it is also worth noting that ERCOT oversaw an ambitious build-out of transmission, bringing West Texas wind east to load centers through the Competitive Renewable Energy Zone, or CREZ initiative for short, which was approved by the Public Utility Commission in 2008 and cost around $7 billion to implement. From the perspective of solar development, Texas ranks 10th in the U.S. with 537 megawatts of installed capacity. But forecasts for future development are pretty impressive and will certainly improve that rank if they come to fruition. Next slide, please. So the competitive market in Texas is primarily focused on near-term economics. What this has meant for solar up until recently is much less development because of the higher costs, meaning higher than other competing generation sources in the competitive market. Of course, as the economics of utility-scale solar keep improving, we expect to see more development, especially in a place like Texas where there's a lot of sunshine. One interesting point we learned on our mission, or talked about on the mission, is that solar and wind tend to compensate each other nicely over the course of a day in Texas, meaning that generally the sun shines at a different time than the wind blows. With better economics, solar may be able to follow the success of Texas wind, which of course is also not a dispatchable generation resource. And the recent extension of the investment tax credit, or ITC, has certainly further supported the business case for solar development in Texas and elsewhere. Lastly, Texas is a pretty sunny state overall, but the best utility-scale solar development is in the West, where there is less cloud cover, which allows for a significant increase in solar production. So, the best economics for solar production are in the West, and transmission infrastructure notwithstanding, this is where we might expect to see development serving the competitive market. Next slide, please. So, interestingly, public power and electric cooperatives have overwhelmingly led solar development in Texas so far. If you take a step back and think about some of the broader trends in the energy industry, this makes sense. The future energy industry is one where customers have more power to choose their energy sources and control their energy use. And we see the improving economics of solar and other distributed energy resources bringing this change about very quickly in the places where the economic and regulatory stars are aligned. Places like Hawaii and Texas. Municipal and cooperative utilities in Texas have been successful in solar development not just because of the market construct, but because they are combining a lasting, strong connection with their customers, or member owners, as they're often called, with the technical and operational capabilities to deliver the services that those customers want. The executives on the ground in Texas told us that a surprisingly large and growing percentage of their customers want options and not just low-cost, reliable power from whatever source. This makes sense when you think broadly about how many consumers want and have grown to expect the ability to understand, customize, and choose what they buy. More and more that includes power supply and delivery. And of course, this trend only increases the importance of connecting with customers and innovating to give them what they want. Munis and co-ops have also been well positioned in Texas because they offer full retail service to their customers. That enables a longer term view on these investments in solar. So these folks are ahead of the curve on recognizing and figuring out how to solve the very real technical and program implementation challenges of distributed energy resources. The rest of us have time to figure these things out, some more time than others, as the economics improve for many of these technologies like batteries and smart inverters. Next slide, please. So we finished this part of the discussion with some examples of leadership from munis and co-ops in solar development. And there certainly are more, but these are three utilities that are worth taking a closer look at. So let's go over these that are on the page in front of us. Austin Energy, a muni in Austin, obviously, has a goal to meet 65% of energy with renewable resources by 2025. This includes 750 megawatts of utility-scale solar and 200 megawatts of local solar, half of which should be customer-sided PV. Austin Energy also shifted from net metering to a value of solar payment, which a lot of folks are talking about, and Austin Energy is actually doing. This value of solar payment attempts to quantify the value at which the utility is neutral, essentially, to paying for locally generated PV. Austin Energy has also signed multiple utility-scale solar purchase power agreements, or PPAs, totaling more than 400 megawatts. And under development is a community solar project that integrates storage as well. So some really interesting things going on in Austin, and not just in solar, if you've ever been to Austin. CPS Energy over in San Antonio is the municipal there. CPS pays a host fee to customers to allow developers to install solar on the customer's rooftops. The developer owns the panels and then sells that power back to CPS Energy. So an interesting arrangement among the parties there. CPS also has a roofless solar program, which is pretty interesting. It allows their customers to own panels that are actually located in a utility scale system, and then those customers receive an associated bill credit. CPS has also driven some pretty impressive local economic development through their solar activity. Multiple solar and smart grid companies are locating jobs in the community or supporting related educational initiatives. The amount of benefit CPS Energy estimates here in economic development is a pretty large number. So very impressive work there. Lastly, we take a look at Georgetown Utility Systems, which is a cooperative that's located about a half hour north of Austin. And Georgetown, as we see on the slide, is moving to 100% renewables, thanks to storage and active scheduling through ERCOT. Georgetown plans to buy double their energy needs through 2 PPAs, or purchase power agreements. One of the PPAs is a 144 megawatt wind PPA with EDF. Operations for this wind farm began in 2015, and this is on a 20-year fixed price agreement. The other PPA is a 150 megawatt solar PPA with SunEdison, or possibly the next counterparty to this agreement, depending on how all that shakes out. Operations for the solar development here are scheduled to begin before January of 2017, and that agreement is on a 25-year fixed price. And as I mentioned before, there are other examples of leadership from munis and co-ops in Texas for sure, but these three do a nice job of contextualizing some of what is going on in solar development.
Thank you, Mark. John Kerner, I have to admit I've seen a lot of energy presentations in my day, but yours is the only one that I've ever seen that has pictures of both cats and dogs in it. Will you please tell us what actually did happen in the Ukraine? And do you believe cats and dogs should really be friends?
Sure, Stuart. Thank you. Let's just talk about general utility cybersecurity. As we know, securing the utility is becoming increasingly difficult. Just like any company, utilities have to deal with securing their IT assets, securing the information regarding employees and customers and just confidential company information. But as a critical infrastructure company, utilities also have to secure their operational technology. And by that we mean the technology that supports those physical processes that is used to deliver energy services to customers. And if you compound that with recent and developing changes with regard to IT and OT convergence, and by that we mean where the operational technology is beginning to look more and more like information technology, that makes that security burden even more challenging. And all that really points to the need for an enterprise cybersecurity program that covers both information technology and operational technology. And that is demonstrated, I think, real well by the recent Ukrainian power outage. If you could go to the next slide, please. So what happened was at the end of 2015, hackers caused what was approximately a 6-hour outage affecting quite a few customers. There was almost 225,000 customers across a number of regions. And what happened was the hackers were able to remotely switch breakers that cut off power. That in of itself was clever enough, but on top of that, malware was used to actually prevent the technicians responsible for that operational technology from even detecting the attack. And compounding things even more, customer service centers were flooded with calls, which prevented customers from raising alerts about the outage itself. And why this is important is it's really credited as being the first known power outage caused by a cyber attack. It targeted both operational and information technology. And it really reinforces the need for utility cybersecurity programs to include both of these asset classes. And that's not to say that doesn't always happen, but what we typically see is the cybersecurity program and the security team focusing on the information technology. And the operational technology and the securing of that OT really becomes a compliance activity. So the compliance work, the NERC-CIP supporting work is seen as the method for supporting the operational technology without a real enterprise program covering both of that. And from our experience and what we've seen, that leads to gaps. It leads to gaps in terms of what assets ultimately are covered, particularly critical assets, important assets, by cybersecurity programs and what capabilities are applied to those assets. Next page, please. So making that leap from what amounts to a converged cybersecurity program is the fact that IT and OT have historically been distinct. And you can really look at that across a few different dimensions. The purpose of the technologies has varied, right? So IT supports historically business transactions. It supports collaboration. It supports decision support. It supports humans interacting with other humans. On the operational side, the OT is really used to control physical processes. So it really supports the interaction of machines to other machines. And those differences really amount to changes in terms of how those assets are managed. The organizations that are supported differ. IT supports corporate end users, back office functions, customer support functions. But OT supports the generation and distribution and transmission operations. The asset types themselves are different. IT has historically relied on commodity and standard-based technologies. They've been more dynamic and more willing to change out those technologies as those technologies have improved. They've been more willing to even make changes in more of a real-time environment when vulnerabilities have been identified. Whereas on the OT side, those assets tend to be proprietary. They tend to be static. These historically are assets that haven't changed much over the last few years. Not only have the underlying technologies changed, but even bringing an OT system down, for example, to apply a patch, that doesn't happen very often because that has to be tied to a release window, because of the fact that when you bring the system down, you're also impacting the processes that system supports. If you also look then at the security priorities between the two assets, or the two asset types, I focus on confidentiality of information. I'm looking at protecting the confidentiality of important information and making sure it doesn't fall into the wrong hands. OT is less concerned about confidentiality, but it's really more about the availability of systems. I'm concerned about the reliability of those systems and the safety of those systems and supporting business processes. And what that really leads to is differences in terms of how these assets are managed, differences in terms of how decisions are made, and even cultural differences. IT and OT assets, IT and OT organizations are actually often distrustful of each other and suspicious of each other's motives. And oftentimes this can be traced back to really a simple misunderstanding of some of these differences and these distinctions we just discussed. So, for example, when an IT or a security staff member who's familiar with IT and how to secure IT assets tries to apply those same types of practices and makes those same kind of assumptions with OT assets, they quickly find out from the engineers supporting those operational assets that you just cannot make those same assumptions. The ability to apply a patch, the frequency to which I apply a patch, the ability to manage and monitor the environment and the network and introduce tools that do so can often have an adverse impact to those operational networks and those operational environments. So some of those cultural distinctions and cultural differences, and again, oftentimes lack of trust, can be tied back to simply a misunderstanding or a lack of awareness of those differences in those asset types and what drives some of the differences in priorities across those different asset types. Next slide, please. So there's been some recent developments that are changing these distinctions, some for the better, but some to make what's already a challenging situation perhaps even a little bit more challenging. The first is what we commonly refer to as IT-OT convergence, which is OT systems are moving towards standard and commodity technology platforms. So you're starting to see OT systems run on IP networks and run on Windows operating systems. So again, characteristics that look more like what you see in an IT environment. New technologies are being introduced into operating environments. So these are all terms that we've all heard, the notion of the Internet of Things, of mobility, and cloud computing are creeping in. But they're having significant benefit. They're having real tangible benefits in terms of how we monitor assets, in terms of how we manage work and distribute work packages, for example, throughout a plant environment. Again, those things look like IT, and they're things that we're all familiar with seeing in an office environment, but less so in a plant environment. Real-time energy trading and demand response requirements have also forced the integration of IT and OT information. right? So to have appropriate energy trading line of sight, we need to be able to mingle and commingle both of those types of information. And that has in itself its own network requirements and things that perhaps have historically been kept separate. Now we have to come up with ways by which we can integrate those in order to provide that consolidated view of information. And then finally, inefficiencies and talent shortages are forcing companies to relook at how these technologies are managed. So we have distinct technologies that have distinct priorities that have been managed by really distinct workforces. The IT folks manage the IT assets, the engineers manage the OT assets, but that itself has oftentimes introduced inefficiencies. And in a world where we're trying to figure out how we can eliminate those inefficiencies, forcing some companies to look at, is there a way to provide common support across IT and OT? But even things like talent shortages and retention become important. As we discussed earlier, those OT systems have been around years, sometimes even decades. And so retention of folks that really know how to understand a system, and it may be a system that honestly very few people on the planet understand, becomes very important. So I either have to retain those folks or I have to think about how I manage those technologies differently. Next slide, please. So to support these new developments, a converged cybersecurity model. So we talk about IT, OT convergence. We're also specifically talking about cybersecurity convergence. And that new model is required, but there are a number of challenges that have slowed its progress. Cultural and political differences, right? Finding common ground between IT and OT organizations has proven difficult, particularly when those organizations are unaware or perhaps insensitive to those differences that are true legitimate differences between those assets and how they're used and how they're managed. There's technical challenges. Even though the technology is converging, there's still differences in the actual environments in which those converged technologies are being deployed. Installing a system in a plant environment is remarkably different than installing it in a data center or an office environment in terms of conditions and tolerance requirements. The workforce required in this converged world is also challenging. The nature of these systems requires knowledge of both those current technologies and those older, more outdated technologies. And you do not necessarily hire off the street those types of people. You hire people who have those capabilities, but there is a bit of a learning curve and training required and able to provide that converged support. And then finally, security challenges themselves. There is a benefit that is known with having obscure technology and proprietary technologies, and it's this concept known as security through obscurity, right? I need to have some knowledge of a system in order to actually execute some cybersecurity mission, to actually exploit some type of a threat. And if it's a system that very few people know about, that actually, there's security benefit in having that type of an obscure, unprecedented type of an environment. But when you move more towards a converged environment, that simplification moves those OT systems into systems and technologies that are more readily understood, both by the people supporting them, but also perhaps people who might do harm to those systems. Next slide, please. So a converged cybersecurity program, there are certain things we can learn from folks that have been successful with those, as well as other similar types of effort. It does require a new approach to cybersecurity programs. The scope and mandate for converged security needs to come from the top. When you start talking about managing across technology assets and asset types, you're talking about managing across really organizational and functional boundaries, and that does not happen naturally. So that's where some of that leadership that cross-functional leadership is required. Secondly, acknowledging and designing programs that account for those legitimate differences between IT and OT environments are important. Again, that one-size-fits-all solution will not work. If there's any guarantee in all this, moving to a one-size-fits-all approach is guaranteed to have a dysfunctional cybersecurity program. So creating awareness and making people aware, again, of those legitimate differences between those environments, whether they're priorities environments, and the actual use of those different asset types becomes very important in terms of how you secure in a converged cybersecurity program. Thirdly, realize that cybersecurity is a journey. When we talk to folks responsible for securing these different asset types, and this particularly is true on the OT side, there's often the question, well, where do I start? I've got OT assets that I don't even know about, and how am I supposed to secure those? And just like any task similar to that, you got to start somewhere. So how do you break that down into actionable and achievable tasks, right? So how do you, as part of that journey, say, all right, what's most important? What's the next most important thing I can do? What assets can I be looking at and segment, secure those, and then identify the next most important set of assets, and then iterate that until you've reached some sufficient stage of security. And lastly, support those efforts with strong governance, strong oversight, strong project management capabilities, and organizational change management. If you look at really each of these lessons, it's less about the technology and it's more about how do we make sure we're dealing with employees, changing employee behaviors, providing governance and oversight. How do you put together the appropriate management and oversight to make sure that we can implement these capabilities across, again, what has historically been a pretty complex environment? Thanks, Stuart.
Thank you, John. Well, the dog and cat look pretty friendly in this picture. Maybe IT and OT can converge after all. So now let's please take your questions. Thank you for submitting them along the way. And here's the first one, and it's for you, John Peng. John, the question is, with the rapid deployment of distributed solar, can you describe how that has affected system planning for the Hawaiian utilities?
Thanks, Stuart. The Hawaiian utilities, with all the distributed energy resources on their system now, particularly solar, they've adopted a more refined approach to system planning and what the Hawaiian electric officials call hosting capacity. Hosted capacity is the amount of distributed generation that can be safely interconnected onto a circuit. So instead of relying on simple rules of thumb, metrics like daytime minimum load, the Hawaiian utilities model the specific characteristics of each circuit to more accurately determine hosting capacity. And so they look at each line and they see whether it can support more solar or not. And so this process allows identification and focused management of individual circuits that have the potential to cause issue for the broader system. And as a result, the utility is able to accommodate more amounts of distributed solar.
Thank you, John. Mark, this question is for you. You know, we've had start-stop on the investment tax credit, production tax credit, and all that stuff. So how did the recent extension of the investment tax credit impact expectations for solar being developed in Texas?
Well, thanks, Stuart. It's expected to have a very significant impact on installed solar capacity in Texas over the next few years. If you take a look at our energy industry update, projected installations in 2016 are slightly down after the ITC, and that's just because there is less urgency in getting them in the ground this year. Longer term, significantly more developments expected with the extension. It'll just be pushed out over the life of the extension. There are some good figures published by Green Tech Media, and the comparison there is for the 5-year period starting in this year, 2016, the forecast for installed solar in Texas pre-ITC extension, so before the extension, was a little over 2.5 gigawatts. After the extension, that same forecast, same time period, was more than 5.5 gigawatts. So an increase of, upwards of 120%, I believe. So pretty significant impact based on the extension in Texas.
Thank you, Mark. John Kerner, this one's for you. So you talked about the converging environment and IT and OT. How do companies determine where do you start your cybersecurity programs?
Thanks, Stuart. Good question. There's two ways, right? Where we see is different organizations spinning up efforts, and oftentimes these are, the focusing on an area of least resistance. But we really recommend a more strategic approach. There's a tool that the Department of Energy has come out with. It's called the Cybersecurity Capability Maturity Model. A lot of folks, I'm sure, on this webinar are familiar with the C2M2. And this is used to really take a look at what cybersecurity capabilities are in place, right? Most utilities do have some capabilities in place. And what this assessment allows you to do is say, okay, for different asset types, so I might assess my IT, I might assess my distribution, OT, right? I might break it up into multiple assessments, but it allows me to look at what capabilities are currently in place and what gaps exist, right? So it gives you some indication of where you are versus what are generally accepted good cybersecurity practices. And then from that, you make a determination of all right, so which of those gaps do I go after next? Now, fortunately, there's some logic that can be used there, because some of these practices where you might have gaps are considered foundational practices, right? So an example might be being able to account for simply what assets do I have. So that's considered an asset management cybersecurity capability. I really have to be able to account for those, and if I'm going to be doing some more of these other types of practices, applying them to those assets. I got to know what I have before I can take actions to secure them. So you can go after those different foundational types of capability gaps. So you really got two decisions to make, right? Which assets am I going to go after, and what capabilities am I going to go after? The C2M2 allows you to look at which capabilities you should go after first, using that foundational kind of logic. What assets you should go after really needs to, you need to look at what are your critical processes and what assets support those critical processes. So that's more of a risk-based approach. So as you can see, it's again more of a strategic, methodical approach where I look at what's important and I go after those first, and then what's next most important. I think, Stuart, the one important point to note, though, is your security team cannot answer those questions, right? They are not and should not be empowered to make those decisions in a vacuum. You really need to get the business engaged in terms of making those decisions in terms of where to start your cybersecurity program.
So it's not just cats and dogs?
It's not just cats and dogs.
Thanks, John. The two related questions about emerging technologies, and the first one, John Peng, did you see the adoption of emerging technologies like smart technology in Hawaii? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, we did, Stuart. One strategy for incorporating distributed generation is to focus on making it much less of a passive resource on the grid. And so in Hawaii, they've been experimenting and testing these different technologies, And this is being accomplished through the use of smart inverters, load management, and storage. This technology is very flexible, and there was one particular instance where they did a software update for almost 1 million smart inverters in a single day. And so really this allows the utility to stay on top of what's happening and take advantage of the emerging technologies. Coupled with detailed analytics, the technological capabilities have allowed the grid to interconnect more and more distributed resources than originally envisioned.
Thank you, John. This next one I'll take. It's a broader question about the same thing. What are the biggest obstacles in large-scale adoption of innovative alternative energy supply models? There are really 3 things that are holding us back. The players in the industry, the customers, and the technology. And as we'll talk about, all of these restraining forces could be driving forces. So the players, as John mentioned in Hawaii, in some cases are being more reactive than proactive, and that's holding things back, the traditional utility players. The new players, in some cases, are being more adversarial than cooperative, and that's creating a contentious environment that does not move the ball forward. And the regulators tend to move slowly in most places and more slowly than the technology. The second thing is the customers. It's very difficult to create new markets. Apple can do it, but utilities can't always. It's very difficult to understand customer tastes and preferences for goods and services that don't exist. And then the third is the technology. It kind of goes back to a theme of neither fish nor fowl. You look at this stuff like storage, and the world is set up, I want to know, are you generation, are you transmission, are you distribution? And into the playing field walks storage, and it doesn't fit in any of the boxes, so we don't know what to do with it. We don't get the market rules right. We can't really accommodate it. And we also have some issues like standards. You know, we talked about smart inverters, but the current IEEE standards call for turning off the advanced inverter controls, which makes the inverters not so smart. So the way the players are behaving, the difficulty of customers in new markets, and the technology, in some ways are bigger driving, restraining forces than they should be today to adoption of innovative alternative energy supply models. But the good news is all of those things can be turned around and can go the other way, and our belief is that over the next 10 years you're going to see that increasingly happen. We have time for just one more question, I believe, and this one is for Mark Miller. So you said that in Texas the wind blows at night and the sun shines during the day, which we appreciate your pointing out. How does the cost compare between solar and wind? Which one is cheaper?
Well, one way to look at that is to use a convenient and commonly used way of comparing, which is you know, the costs over the full life of the asset, and that's the levelized cost of energy. So that's a dollar per kilowatt hour, megawatt hour measure, sometimes called the LCOE, as probably most people on the call know. The investment bank Lazard prepares an analysis of this for various renewable and conventional power generation technologies. In the latest one, which I believe was from last November, it compared unsubsidized, so you know, without incorporating subsidies, wind and solar in a number of different regions, including Texas. And solar ranged from mid $50 per megawatt hour to just under $200 per megawatt hour. Wind was from, I believe, around $35, $36 per megawatt hour to just over $50 per megawatt hour, based on, you know, assumptions and capital costs for constructing some onshore wind. So wind is still quite a bit cheaper than solar, but solar is certainly competitive with conventional generation in Texas by this measure.
Thank you, Mark. With that, we'll wrap up and turn it back over to PJ. First, we want to thank PJ and Energy Central for hosting this webinar. Second, we want to thank all of you. We know how busy you are. We really appreciate your time today, and it's fun for us to take a step back and think about the industry and talk about it. We would invite you to learn more about these topics in our Scott Madden Energy Industry Update and the other 12 that are included. It really is to us an odd time in the industry, a time when unusual things are juxtaposed with each other, a time that's really neither fish nor fowl. With that, thanks very much. And PJ, can you close us out?
Of course. Thank you, Stuart. And thank you, speakers. Great presentation. For our audience, we hope you've enjoyed today's discussion. As you log off, please take a moment to complete our survey and give us your feedback so that we can continue to provide you with quality content. Thank you for attending. This concludes today's presentation.